There are things people often overlook in life, small moments that seem unimportant, yet decide the fate of an entire soul. Like that morning when the crowd in town didn't spare a second glance at a woman past 50, heavy-set head bowed, put up for auction as if she were no more than a bundle of chores. To them, she was finished good only for cooking and cleaning not worth holding on to. And then came the giant rancher, a man of few words broad as the horizon, who stepped forward and said four simple words: "You're coming with me." At first it wasn't a promise. It wasn't kindness. It was a transaction, cold and ordinary. But what the crowd missed, the thing no one noticed, was the way his eyes shifted when he saw her tears fall quietly onto her worn apron. That overlooked moment was the spark that changed everything. For behind her frame, behind the years of rejection and ridicule, lived a heart that had carried too much pain, yet still longed to be seen to be loved. And behind his silence was a man who had lost more than he could name, a man who thought his heart had hardened for good, until her tears softened it. The story begins as tragedy, a woman treated like an object, and a man who believed he was buying nothing more than a cook. But when grief recognized grief, when quiet sorrow met quiet strength, something unexpected stirred. Her tears, born of shame and loneliness, began to thaw the ice around him. What happens when a woman the world had discarded becomes the very treasure one man had been searching for? When a kitchen meant only for bread and stew becomes the hearth where two broken souls find warmth again. This isn't just a story about tears melting a giant's heart. It is a story for those who thought life had already passed them by, only to discover that sometimes love arrives later but shines deeper. Do you want to know how after those tears love finally found them? The first snow had the dignity to arrive quietly that year. Frost laced across porch rails and blue shadow, pooling under wagons like sleeping dogs. The courthouse steps were swept clean, but cold still rose through the boards into Evelyn Hart's bones as she stood on the makeshift platform and watched the town rearrange itself around her. Sagebrush Ferry was small enough that everyone knew the history written in one another's faces. If they didn't know the facts, they knew the posture. The way a woman pulls her shawl when people have taken more than they should. The way a man leans on a post when he's done being welcome anywhere else. Folks in that square knew Evelyn's posture by heart. 50 years old. Once the obedient daughter of a riverboat carpenter. Once the reluctant wife of a gambler who won her future on a card table and then squandered it in the same breath. She'd buried her mother, then her father, then the tiny, nearly weightless hopes of children who never stayed. What remained was a house of silence, an ache under the sternum, and hands that had learned to meet hard mornings with steady work. Her boots were thin, but they were boots. She had scrubbed them the night before out of habit rather than hope. A county deputy set a ledger on a crate and read her name as if it belonged to the weather. Evelyn Hart, domestic hire. Board of Supervisors winter bond to be let for 3 months with option. The way he said option made it sound like a door someone else would open. It wasn't an auction of a person, so the deputy would have said. It was a hiring out on a bond wages against winter accommodations, someone to keep a stove lit and a roof patched when the wind forgot manners. Folks called it decent charity, but nobody likes a ledger line with a woman's name on it. It turns gossip into arithmetic. Start at $4 a month, the deputy said, clearing his throat. Room and fires included. No one spoke. A brass hinge creaked on the hotel door the way a throat clears when it doesn't want to be noticed. Down the steps, a boy coughed into his scarf. His mother put a hand on his back and didn't look up. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the far cottonwoods along the river and reminded herself that trees continue to be trees, even when their leaves are gone. Someone called finally a freighter, with a belly like a rain barrel and breath that made the cold smell cheaper. "You'll get your wood hauled too," a man in a felt cap asked, hopeful for a laugh. $2.50, the freighter bargained against nobody but the silence. The deputy frowned at his ledger. "4 is fair," he muttered to the paper, "more than the men." Evelyn kept her hands tucked under her shawl. She could bake without a recipe pack, a trunk like a surgeon closes a wound, and make coffee strong enough to convince a coward to tell the truth. She could save a roof from a gale with 2 nails and a strip of canvas. What she could not do was pretend the town was not doing her a kindness with a knife edge. Wind slipped through the square, finding every crack in the courthouse facade. Somewhere a horse stamped and rang iron on stone, impatient in a way Evelyn envied. Near the back, a trio of boys whispered the way boys always whisper about nothing and everything, and the latest story their big sisters had sworn was true. A woman in a fur collar, too thin to be warm, too expensive not to be noticed, lifted one brow toward Evelyn and then toward the freighter, as if to say that both were equally soft goods now. Two, the freighter said, smelling victory in other people's defeat. Six, a voice answered. It wasn't loud. It didn't challenge. It found its way through the noise and elite like a sparrow at the edge of a boot print. Heads turned the way heads always turn toward a thing you think you know and discover you do not. Jonah Pike stood with his hat brim pulled low and his coat unbuttoned against the cold as if cold did not apply to men his size. He was the kind of tall that made doorways feel like suggestions. His hands were large without being clumsy, the kind that could cradle a newborn calf and a coffee cup with equal concentration. Years of sun had drawn maps across his cheekbones. The winter had given him a new one under his left eye, a faint pale crescent like a small moon he kept for himself. 6 a month he repeated to the ledger, to the wind, to the freighter, who stared as if an ox had begun to recite scripture. Room fires and respect, and I'll supply the coffee. The laugh that followed was startled more than mean. Respect wasn't usually part of the bargain. The deputy's pencil hovered. That's well generous, Mr. Pike. It's fair, Jonah said. A woman near the back said he's got no one up there to keep a pot from freezing to itself. Might be he's buying warm air, not a person. Evelyn pressed her teeth together until something in her jaw said enough. She wanted to be angry at the arrangement, the ledger line, the way the square's gaze traveled her like a surveyor's rod. Anger would be clean. But what rose instead was a long, tired tenderness for herself, childish and almost embarrassing, the desire for a door to close behind her without a slam. The desire for a chair that no one moved when she stood up. Any other bids, the deputy asked, more formal now that the figure had climbed to decency. Let the giant have his housekeeper, the freighter muttered, not brave enough to throw his words where they could be caught. Jonah didn't look at him. He was looking at Evelyn in the manner of a man spotting sky through clouds, something simple and necessary after too much gray. He didn't stare. He didn't squint. He acknowledged. Let it, the deputy said, tapping the ledger. He looked relieved and ashamed at once. Bond assigned to Mr. Pike through March, then softer to Evelyn alone. Mrs. Hart, you'll draw your first week Saturday. Mrs. Hart, widow, divorced, abandoned. There were so many ways to say woman without saying her name. Evelyn made her face into a calm place and gave the deputy a nod that forgave him for what wasn't his fault. Jonah stepped forward and set something on the crate, not a coin, though he had those, but a pair of wool-lined gloves. It's a pretty morning for pretending we don't feel anything, he said, but I'd as soon you had feeling in your fingers on the way up. If pity had been in his voice, Evelyn might have handed the gloves back with a joke sharp enough to draw a little blood. There wasn't. What she heard was the kind of consideration grown people offer one another when they plan to be in the same weather for a while. She took the gloves, slid her hands inside. The warmth felt like an unearned luxury. She kept her face still. They left the square without ceremony. Jonah's wagon waited where the street curved toward the river wheels already webbed with soft snow. He held a hand to help her climb up, but left his palm a span short of her elbow, an offer she could accept without being taken. She stepped up on her own and settled on the plank. His coat smelled like cedar soap and the faint pepper of horse. They didn't speak for the first half mile, which suited them both. The town slipped behind like a story told in the wrong order. Willows grew closer to the road where the river bent. Stubble in the fields took on that pewter sheen winter lays over every ambition and says not yet. Jonah drove with the reins held loose, as if he trusted the team more than he trusted fussing. Wind found Evelyn's collar. She pulled the shawl closer and pretended not to notice the extra blanket on the seat until he nudged it with a knuckle. She tucked it over her lap and said, "Thank you," in a voice that made the words sound new. "Muddle's set by noon," he said, assessing ruts with a squint. "You get motion sick only when someone talks about it?" She answered, and a small corner of his mouth conceded a smile. "You cooked for a household," before he asked after another stretch of silence. "I cooked for men who thought they were households," she said, and regretted the bitterness as soon as it left. "Yes," she added softer. "I can keep folks fed and places clean. I can also mend if needles aren't too proud." He nodded like a man collecting information that matter-of-factly. I can keep animals alive and roofs sound. Between us, that's winter covered. She studied his profile. There are faces you can read, and there are faces that plane themselves down so their thoughts don't get stolen. Jonah's was a map where important towns weren't labeled, but the rivers flowed true if you watched long enough. Why six, she asked, because it had been standing in the air between them, like a lamp someone hadn't lit. You could have said four, and no one would have minded. Fair is easier to sleep with, he said, and I sleep light. The road climbed. Cottonwoods gave way to juniper and scattered stands of pale-barked aspen that rattled like pockets full of coins. His place came into view slow as patience, a long, low house with a porch that hugged it all the way across. A barn set clean to the wind, a line of fence-like stitches closing a wound across the near pasture. Smoke rose from the chimney in a curl that suggested a fire that knew what it was doing. It's not much to look at, he said. It looks like it stands when the weather argues. Evelyn replied, and that coaxed the other corner of his mouth to join the first. He pulled the team up near the porch. Snow leveled the yard into equal white. The steps had been swept recently and not for show. He climbed down and turned back to offer his hand again. She let him help this time, not because she needed it, but because he'd asked with care rather than assumption. Inside smelled like everything useful wood smoke iron coffee, roasted sometime in the last week's saddle soap. The big room held a broad-shouldered stove with a pipe elbowing up and out, a table built of two planks and stubbornness, two chairs that didn't match but had both survived something, a bunk in the corner with blankets folded over the edge like a mouth with a strict parent. A shelf held tin plates with their honest dents and a small glass lamp. In the window, a jar of dried yarrow stalks gave the winter light something to braid itself around. You can have the room at the back, he said. It used to be for my sister when she'd winter through. She married a man with kinder weather, so it's yours if you want it. Door sticks in wet, but it yields to please. He left her there, not hovering, not instructing, just giving the space its new shape. The room was small, tidy as a conscience. A quilt star, blocks in tobacco brown and faded blues, lay neatly on the cot, turned down, as if sleep were a guest who might arrive early. Someone, perhaps Jonah's sister, perhaps Jonah, had scrubbed the window until winter's gray looked like satin instead of fog. Evelyn set her carpetbag at the foot of the bed and stood in the middle of the floor, uncertain what to do with the sudden quiet in her chest. Safety has its own noise. It can frighten a soul used to alarms. She put her palm flat on the plaster wall and let it cool her. There would be time later for tears, the kind that soak and heal instead of spill and embarrass. For the present, there were cupboards to inventory and a stove to learn. She found flour in a lard tin with a strip of clean muslin tucked over the top to assure dignity, cornmeal in a paper sack, dried beans like a jar full of small moons, salt, pepper, 2 onions sullen with keeping, a ham hock skinned and salted enough to keep a family honest. Coffee, of course, 2 pounds of it tucked in a blue paper wrapper like a secret worth saving. When she came back out, Jonah had already stacked wood by the stove, not for show, but because the next hour might be cold and the hour after that worse. He looked up at her the way a neighbor looks at a neighbor when a fence goes up without argument. I'll see to the east trough, he said, reaching for his gloves that weren't where he'd left them because they were on her hands now. He paused. You keep those, he decided aloud. Then, because he didn't want her to mistake generosity for charity, he added, there's another pair somewhere. If there isn't, I've got hands that don't mind the weather. He was almost to the door before he remembered something and turned back. You don't owe me cheerful, he said, or company, or speeches for the sake of gratitude. You owe me exactly what I paid for good meals and the keeping of a clean place. I'll owe you the same fair wages and the keeping of a fair peace. If anyone from town comes up to sniff and speak sideways, you send them back down on their own feet. I don't run my house by committee. She must have been tired beyond reason because the last words struck a nerve that surprised laughter out of her. It startled them both. His smile when it came was quick and then disciplined back into its post. All right then, he said, and went out into the white. Evelyn set water on measured coffee as if the morning weren't already afternoon, and listened to small noises that meant this house was not indifferent. The tick of cooling iron, a dry board settling into its joinery, wind testing the chinked seams and being told to find sport elsewhere. She sat just long enough for a thought to store itself where she could reach it later. That some places permit you to be a person before they ask you to be a worker. Her fingers did the rest on their own onions, diced and sweated beans, sorted and rinsed, cornmeal kissed with salt, and poured like yellow snow into a pot that would not burn it because she would not let it. When the door opened again and Jonah stamped snow from his boots, the room smelled like memory he hadn't known he was missing. They ate at the two-plank table, him, easy, her careful. He'd fetched a second chair from somewhere and planed the wobble off the leg. It sat steady beneath her like a promise she found suspicious and then suddenly didn't. Good, he said when the beans were beans, and not an apology. Thank you, she answered, meaning more than the word could carry without breaking. After, when the bowls were stacked and the lamp turned low, he pulled a folded paper from the pocket of his coat and set it near the edge of the table. This is the bond with the county, he said. I wrote in an extra line about Sunday mornings and any Tuesday you need for yourself. I don't require company in church, and I don't begrudge quiet to the people who keep my roof from sagging. Sign if you like it, strike if you don't. Evelyn watched the paper like one watches ice on the river, testing its will. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote her name in a hand that hadn't forgotten its schooling. The H in Hart stood up straight as if inviting the rest of her to do the same. Jonah's signature sat below hers, not claiming, just companioning. That night in the small room with the star-block quilt, Evelyn closed the door on the day and sat on the edge of the cot. She loosened the knot of her shawl. Fingers found the seam in the coverlet. She followed it like a road leading out of a town where winter had a mean mouth. Tears came, but not the frantic kind. These were orderly, grateful, and done with hiding. She let them have their time and then wiped her face with the corner of the quilt and whispered a thank you to nobody in particular and everybody who had ever chosen to be kind. In the morning, the light came pale and honest through the clean pane. Coffee steamed like good news. Jonah was at the pump before daylight, and the horses shook their manes as if breaking off yesterday. Evelyn stood at the stove and warmed her hands around the tin mug, as if it were the first dignified heat she'd been offered in a decade. Outside, Sagebrush Ferry would tell and retell its small story that the giant up on Cottonwood Rise had gone and paid double to hire winter help, and folks would say he'd been soft or foolish or plain old lonely. Let them. Inside, beans simmered, bread rose, and a woman who had become used to living in parenthesis stepped with careful humor into a sentence that held. On the table, the bond sat under a smooth stone paperweight, a promise weighted just enough to resist drafts. Evelyn touched the edge of it with a fingertip and felt a strange fine thing moving through her like the first thaw under hard drifts. She wasn't safe yet, not from gossip or memory, but she was not for sale any longer. And sometimes that's all salvation needs to begin. As the first storm shouldered toward Cottonwood Rise, Evelyn found tucked beneath the paperweight on the bond a second slip of paper in Jonah's square hand. I bought winter, not you. The house is mine. The days are yours. Let's see if we can make them kinder. She folded it into her pocket and felt it warm there like a coal saved for bleak weather. The days that followed fell into rhythm, the kind of rhythm that comes when silence is shared rather than endured. The great stove breathed steady heat into the house, and the snow pressed close against the windows, making the world feel smaller, tighter, almost safe. Evelyn rose before dawn, hands steady movements practiced. She had done this her whole life, measured flour, coaxed fire, boiled water into warmth, but never before in a place where her work felt seen. She still kept her back straight, her chin level, as if waiting for criticism to snap from the shadows. But instead there was only the sound of boots on the porch, of horses nickering outside, and of Jonah's low voice greeting the morning as if it too needed company. At the table, their conversations began as practical exchanges. Did the beans soften overnight? Yes, I left them on the back of the stove. I'll take the sled into town tomorrow if the weather holds. But beneath the ordinary words was something unusual. No sharp edges, no reminders of her failures, no suspicion tucked into the pauses. Just two people learning the pace of each other's silences. It wasn't until the third morning that Jonah said something that startled her. She had set a loaf of bread to cool the steam curling off it like a soft hymn when he paused by the doorway. My sister used to make bread that smelled like that, he said quietly. House always felt larger on baking days. Evelyn almost smiled, but the smile carried weight. Did she leave it for you to slice always? He said, his eyes flicking toward her. Said I cut it straighter than she could. Truth was, she didn't like the waiting. They shared a small laugh, the kind that belongs only to people who are still cautious with one another. Later that week, when Jonah returned from town with flour lamp oil and a sack of apples rare for the season, he set them on the table without a word. But when Evelyn peeled one that evening, and the scent rose sharp and sweet into the lamplight, she realized no man spends coin on fruit in winter unless he remembers how sweetness once mended him. That night she sat by the window in her small room, the quilt pulled across her knees, and she let herself think of how long it had been since anyone had brought something home, not out of duty, but out of thoughtfulness. It was then she caught her reflection in the glass, lined, yes, and weathered, but with a softness she had not seen in years. Outside, the snow deepened, and the house seemed to lean into the storm. Inside, two lives, one scarred by years of silence, the other by years of loneliness, began quietly to find recognition in each other. That evening, Jonah asked the question as she had not expected. Do you ever miss being called by your first name? The way he said Evelyn after that slow, deliberate with respect, made her chest tighten in a way she had not felt since girlhood. The thaw came late that year, the kind of stubborn winter that refused to release its grip on the land. Snowbanks still clung to the cedar fence outside, and the mornings bit as sharply as December. But it wasn't the weather that chilled Evelyn. It was the visit. It happened on a Tuesday. The sound of wagon wheels crunching against frozen ground reached the cabin before the knock. When Jonah opened the door, two figures stood framed against the gray sky: Tess Wilkins, sharp-eyed and sharp-tongued, and her husband Thad, who never seemed to say anything without her leave. Well, Tess said, her gaze raking over Evelyn, who stood by the hearth with a towel in her hands. I see she's found herself a warm corner again. Evelyn felt the words like stones thrown small but stinging. She tightened her grip on the towel and said nothing. Jonah's jaw flexed, but his voice was even. Did you come for flour or for gossip? Just making sure you know what the town's saying, Tess replied. A man doesn't bring home a woman like her just for biscuits. Folks remember her past, Jonah. Some scars don't wash off with soap. The silence that followed was thick as the snow outside. Evelyn stood, frozen heat rising in her chest, though her face remained calm. She wanted to shout to defend herself, but her years of endurance held her tongue. She only folded the towel again and again, as if the motion could keep her hands from shaking. Jonah's voice finally cut through, steady as an axe through timber. You're done. Tess blinked. You're done. Her husband tugged her arm, and soon the wagon wheels retreated into the distance. That night the silence in the cabin was different. Not the comfortable hush they had been learning, but one heavy with unspoken things. Evelyn set stew on the table and stepped back, unable to meet his eyes. You should have let her finish, she said quietly. I wanted to hear it all. You've heard enough. I've heard worse. Her voice cracked. She swallowed, then added, I lived it. For the first time, Jonah looked directly at her, and there was no hesitation in his words. You didn't deserve it. The conviction in his tone pierced her armor. For a moment she felt something dangerous stir in her chest, hope. And yet hope frightened her more than shame ever had. That night when he went out to the barn, she sat by the table and scrubbed it until the wood grain reddened her hands raw, as if she could erase her past by scouring hard enough. By dawn she had packed a satchel, a blanket, a biscuit, a note that simply read, Thank you for the warmth. She stepped to the door, trembling. But when she opened it, Jonah was already there, coat on arms, crossed eyes, unreadable. You leaving? I don't belong here. His gaze didn't waver. You think you belong back in that town? Her throat tightened. She couldn't answer. He stepped aside, leaving the doorway open. Go if you want, but I'd rather you didn't. The words that followed struck her harder than any insult Tess had ever thrown. Peace ain't real if it can't hold pain too. She froze, satchel in hand, torn between running from love and risking it. The satchel slipped from Evelyn's hand, landing softly on the wooden floorboards. For a long moment, neither she nor Jonah moved. The cold morning air swept in through the open doorway, curling around her ankles like a test of her resolve. She finally spoke, her voice thin but steady. You said you needed peace. I still do. What if I ruin it? He nodded, once solemn, as if he had wrestled the question himself 1,000 times. Peace ain't worth much if it can't hold pain too. Her breath caught. In all her 50 years, no one had ever said something like that to her. Men had wanted her silence, her service, or her submission, but never her truth. She closed the door slowly, as if it weighed more than a barn door, and laid the satchel by the wall. That evening, she set the table for two instead of one. When Jonah came in from the barn, his face dusted with snow, he carried something in his hands, a chair. It was handmade, uneven, sturdy. He set it at the table without a word. Figured one chair ain't enough anymore. She stared at him at the quiet invitation. And for the first time in years, Evelyn sat at a table that felt like it might be hers. The days that followed stitched themselves together like a quilt of small mercies. She baked bread that rose uneven but smelled of home. He brought her apples from town, placing them on her pillow without comment. She mended one of his old shirts by the fire, her hands remembering how to care even as her heart trembled with the risk of it. One night as the fire burned low, she whispered, "Why me, Jonah? Why bring me here?" He set down his cup and leaned forward, his voice low. "Because I saw a woman who was left out in the cold, and I know what that feels like. You don't deserve to stay there." She turned away before he could see the tears welling in her eyes. It terrified her how much she wanted to believe him. Terrified her even more that she already did. That night, as she pulled the quilt over her knees, a thought slipped through her mind like a spark in the dark. What if this cabin wasn't a cage but a beginning? Snow had started to melt in patches, leaving the earth soggy and dark. The thaw brought wagons from town up the narrow road to Jonah's ranch, traders' neighbors, and with them whispers. On a gray afternoon, Evelyn was sweeping the hearth when a knock rattled the door. She opened it to find Clara Wilkes, a sharp-tongued widow from town, with her brother Henry standing stiffly behind her. Well, Clara said, her eyes sliding over Evelyn's plain dress and calloused hands, looks like Jonah Creed finally found himself a cook. The pause carried all the weight of cruelty disguised as courtesy. Evelyn swallowed, gripping the broom tighter. Jonah stepped up behind her. His presence filled the doorway like a wall of stone. "Say what you came to say, Clara." Clara's mouth twitched. "And what happens when that's not enough?" He didn't answer. Not because he didn't know, but because he refused to let fear write the story for them. Instead, he reached for her satchel, the same one she had tried to leave with. He set it by the door again, his eyes steady. "If you think you don't belong here, I won't stop you. But I'd rather you stayed." Her hands trembled against the broom handle. For the second time in weeks, she realized the choice was hers. Truly hers. That night, Evelyn sat at the table across from Jonah, the firelight painting soft gold across his face. She wondered if she could ever believe a man meant those words. She wondered if after half a lifetime of being discarded, she could risk letting herself be wanted. As snow fell once more outside, Evelyn asked herself the question that had haunted her for years. What if love hadn't passed her by, but was waiting for her to believe it? The thaw of spring came with mud-swollen streams and the kind of travelers who carried more malice than news. One evening, as Evelyn was ladling stew into bowls, the sound of hooves cracked against the silence of the valley. Jonah looked up from the table, eyes narrowing. Visitors were rare, and uninvited ones rarer still. A sharp rap echoed on the cabin door. Jonah rose, his frame filling the space as he pulled it open. On the porch stood a man in a worn coat, the brim of his hat shadowing a face Evelyn knew too well. Her stomach tightened. "Evelyn Creed," the stranger said, voice oily with false charm. Then his gaze slid past Jonah, landing on her. His smile spread like a wound reopening. "Evelyn Evelyn." Her breath caught. Thomas Hale, her former husband. The man who had broken her in more ways than she could count. She steadied the ladle with trembling fingers, but her voice betrayed her. "What are you doing here?" Thomas tipped his hat as if he were the gallant suitor he never was. "Heard you were still alive. Word travels. Imagine my surprise finding you in another man's cabin." His tone twisted the last word like an accusation. Jonah stood firm, saying nothing yet, but his silence carried weight, a warning. Evelyn set the ladle down and stepped forward, though her knees shook. "You left me years ago, Thomas. You made your choice." He chuckled low and mean. "A man don't give up what's his. By law, you're still mine. You think a paper no one ever signed changes that. You think this rancher here can buy you like a mule and make it true." Jonah's hand flexed at his side, but he didn't move. You best choose your next words carefully, he said voice. Like gravel dragged over stone. Thomas smirked. Careful's for men who fear consequences. He stepped closer, the porch boards groaning under his weight. His eyes pinned Evelyn. Pack your things. You're coming back with me. I won't ask twice. Memories surged, nights of silence filled with his disdain, the sting of words that stripped her dignity, the emptiness he left behind when he rode off with another woman, leaving her to face shame alone. Evelyn felt them all rising, pressing against her ribs like the tide against a breaking dam. For so many years she had swallowed her voice, convinced it was safer not to speak. But now with Jonah standing behind her, his presence steady as an oak, something inside her shifted. Her lips parted, and though her voice trembled, it carried, I'm not yours. Not then. Not now. Not ever again. Thomas's smile curdled. You think this man will protect you? He'll tire of you same as I did. Who wants a barren, aging woman when the bloom's gone? You'll see. He'll throw you aside like yesterday's bread. The words pierced like arrows, but Evelyn didn't flinch this time. Her eyes stung, but she held steady. Maybe he will. Maybe he won't. But even if he does, it won't be because you said I was worthless. I don't belong to you. I never did. You only taught me to forget my own worth. Thomas barked a laugh, then lunged as if to grab her arm. In a heartbeat, Jonah stepped forward, his massive hand clamping Thomas's wrist midair. The rancher's voice was low, steady, and dangerous. Get your hand off her or lose it. Thomas's bravado faltered under the force of Jonah's grip. He yanked his arm back, scowling. This ain't over, he spat, stepping off the porch. She'll come crawling back. Women like her always do. His horse snorted as he swung into the saddle, but his eyes flickered just for a moment with the recognition that he had lost the ground beneath him. When he rode off, the night swallowed the sound of hooves. Silence pressed heavy. Evelyn's hands shook, but not from fear alone. For the first time she realized she hadn't hidden behind Jonah. She had spoken. She had stood. Jonah closed the door softly, not slamming it. He turned to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes steady. You don't owe me an explanation, he said quietly. Evelyn sank into the chair, burying her face in her hands. He made me believe I was nothing. That's what I carried all these years. Jonah crouched beside her, his large hands resting on his knees. You ain't nothing, Evelyn. You're the bravest woman I've ever seen. You faced him after everything he did, and you didn't break. Her tears came then, hot and unrelenting, but different this time. Not the tears of shame or defeat, but of release, of finally letting the weight slip from her shoulders. I don't know how to start over, she whispered. Jonah's voice softened, almost a rumble. You don't start over. You just start from here, with what you've got left, with who you are now. That's enough. She lifted her head slowly, meeting his gaze. His face, weathered and scarred by his own burdens, carried no judgment, only a quiet strength that made her believe for the first time in decades that maybe she could be enough. That night, Evelyn didn't retreat to the cot. She sat by the fire long after Jonah went to the barn, staring into the flames. The crackle and pop of burning wood sounded like pieces of her old life collapsing into ash. And for once, she wasn't afraid of the silence left behind. In the deep hours of the night, she touched the shawl hanging beside Jonah's coat and thought of the life she might dare to claim. A life where she wasn't someone's possession, wasn't someone's afterthought, but someone's choice. As dawn pressed pale light through the frosted window, Evelyn asked herself, could she truly lay down the chains of her past and believe that love even now could rise from the ashes? The days after Thomas Hale's departure were hushed, as though the valley itself exhaled a burden it had carried too long. The snow melted in slow rivulets along the fence line, and wild crocuses began to push their purple heads through the thawing earth. Spring was coming, and with it something stirring between Evelyn and Jonah that neither of them dared to name aloud. Evelyn still rose before dawn each morning, setting bread to rise and sweeping the hearth. She found her hands less tremulous now, as though they remembered what it was to serve not out of duty, but from the quiet joy of creating warmth in a home. Jonah, for his part, went about his chores with the same steady rhythm, but now when he returned from the barn, his boots paused at the door, waiting almost expectant. One evening, as Evelyn mended a tear in Jonah's shirt by the fire, he lingered in the doorway watching. His silence no longer felt like distance. It felt like presence, like he was letting her know she was seen, not measured. "You don't have to keep sewing for me," he said at last, voice roughened with shyness. "I know," Evelyn answered without lifting her gaze. "That's why I do." Her words hung in the air, soft yet weighty. Jonah crossed the room and set a small bundle on the table. Inside lay a bar of soap, coarse but scented faintly with lavender. "I traded for it in town," he muttered. "Thought you might like something finer than lye soap." Evelyn's throat tightened. No one had thought of such a small kindness for her in years. She touched the soap with her fingertips as if it were porcelain. "Thank you," she whispered. "It's been a long time since someone remembered me in that way." Jonah cleared his throat, awkward as a boy. "Figured you deserve better than just surviving." The moment passed, but the warmth of it lingered between them, like an ember refusing to die. Weeks later, the first true warmth of spring rolled into the valley. Evelyn was feeding hens when she noticed Jonah working in the barn, hammering something with unusual care. Hours passed, the rhythm of nails driving into wood steady as a heartbeat. When she finally stepped inside, she found him standing beside a cradle. Not polished, not perfect, but sturdy, carved by his own hands. She froze. "Jonah?" Why, he rubbed the back of his neck, his voice low. "A man can build many things. Some just because he hopes. Doesn't mean it'll be filled. Just means the house feels less empty, knowing it could be." Evelyn's breath caught. She thought of all the years she had been called barren, unwanted, less than. Yet here stood a man who built not out of demand or entitlement, but out of hope, hope that love could shape more than just the present moment. She stepped forward, laying her hand on the cradle's edge. "I don't know if I can give you children, Jonah. That chance may be long past." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I didn't build it for children only. I built it to say, I want a future with you, however it comes. Empty or full, it's ours if you'll have it." Her heart trembled. Tears pricked her eyes, but they were not the bitter tears of the past. They were new, fragile, like the crocuses pressing through snow. "I thought I was done with love," she whispered. "Maybe love wasn't done with you," Jonah replied. That Sunday, Jonah hitched the wagon. Evelyn climbed in her hands, smoothing the shawl she had once clutched in shame. They rode in silence down the winding path until the small chapel came into view, its white paint peeling bell tower, leaning slightly from years of storms. Jonah dismounted first, then turned and offered his hand. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then placed hers in his. His grasp was warm, firm, not demanding, but inviting. Together they stepped inside. The preacher looked up in surprise, but Jonah simply laid the old church registry on the table. Evelyn glanced down. There beside her name, written in careful ink, was his own. No flourish, no grand speech, just certainty. He looked at her, then eyes quiet but resolute. "I can't promise you wealth. I can't promise you ease. All I've got is a cabin, 2 hands, and what's left of my heart. But it's yours if you want it." The room was so still she could hear the ticking of the old wall clock. Evelyn's hands trembled as she touched the page. For a moment, the ghost of her past, the rejection, the cruelty, the years of silence rose up to choke her. And then, like snow thawing under the sun, it melted away. She lifted her chin, met his eyes, and said, "Yes, I want it." The following weeks unfolded not like a blaze, but like a slow, steady fire. Evelyn planted herbs by the kitchen window. Jonah built her a second chair for the table, sturdy, though lopsided, and placed it across from his own. They ate together, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation that drifted like river currents, unhurried, unforced. One evening, as dusk fell pink across the valley, Evelyn stood on the porch, shawl draped around her shoulders. Jonah joined her, hands tucked into his coat. They watched the horizon together, the quiet between them, rich, not empty. "I never thought peace could be this," she murmured. Jonah tilted his head. "What's that?" She smiled faintly. "Not the absence of noise, just having someone beside me who doesn't demand I be less than I am." Jonah looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Peace that can hold pain too. That's the only kind worth having." She leaned against him, then not out of desperation, but out of choice. And for the first time in her 50 years, Evelyn felt what it meant to belong, not as someone's burden, not as someone's afterthought, but as someone's home. The summer sun stretched long across the valley. The hens clucked contentedly, the fields ripened, and laughter, quiet, cautious, at first began to find its way into the cabin. Evelyn often found herself humming as she cooked, surprised by the sound of her own voice freed from years of silence. One evening, Jonah returned from the barn with an apple in his palm. He placed it on the table before her. "For you," he said simply. She looked up, smiling softly. For no reason, he shrugged. For every reason. Her heart swelled. It wasn't grand gestures that healed her. It was these crumbs of kindness, these steady drops of tenderness that filled the cracks time and cruelty had left. As autumn approached, Evelyn often thought back to the day she had stood on the auction block, stripped of dignity, believing her life was over. Now she sat in the rocking chair. Jonah had mended a knitted shawl over her shoulders, the scent of stew drifting through the cabin and Jonah's steady presence filling the room. Life hadn't given her the story she once dreamed of. It had given her something quieter, something stronger, a man who chose her not despite her scars, but because of them. And in that choosing, Evelyn found herself again not the girl she had been, but the woman she had become. And so beneath the wide, Wild West sky, Evelyn whispered to herself, "It's never too late for love, never too late to be chosen." In the end, this story wasn't about a rancher who bought a woman or a woman who cooked to earn her place. It was about two souls worn down by time, scarred by rejection, who somehow found each other when they thought love had already passed them by. Sometimes in life, we believe we are too late, too old, too damaged to be chosen again. But stories like this remind us that the heart doesn't keep time the way the world does. Love, kindness, and second chances can bloom in the most unexpected seasons, even in winter, even after years of silence. Perhaps that is something each of us can carry into our own lives, the courage to keep our hearts open even when the past has been unkind, and the grace to see the worth in others even when the world has overlooked them. Because often what seems like dust to some can be pure gold to the one who knows how to see. If this story touched you, I invite you to join us here at None, Wild West Saga. Subscribe to hear more tales of healing resilience and unexpected love. Share this story with someone who may need the reminder that it's never too late to be loved for who you truly are. And tell me, friends, would you like to see the next part of their journey, or perhaps another story of late blooming love in the Wild West? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.